Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this video is an audiobook-style story created in partnership with Fabularis. If you enjoy complete, emotional, and immersive stories like this one, you can listen to many more on fabularis.com. The link is on description. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and immerse yourself in this story until the very end. In the spring of 2001, a woman named Margaret Ellison arrived at the offices of the Carolina Historical Preservation Society on Meeting Street, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a list of materials she had been hired to catalogue. She was 37 years old, a document restorer and archival consultant who had spent the previous decade working with deteriorating collections in Columbia, Savannah, and twice in New Orleans. She was not the kind of person who believed in haunted archives or cursed papers. She believed in acidity levels, humidity damage, and the particular stubbornness of iron gall ink when it had spent a century and a half pressed against decaying fabric. The Society had recently received a donation of miscellaneous materials from the estate of a retired judge whose family had, over several generations, accumulated boxes, folders, and envelopes of documents related to Charleston's antebellum commercial history. Most of it was exactly what it appeared to be: shipping manifests, insurance letters, church attendance records, maps of waterfront property boundaries, and correspondence between merchants. The kind of material that tells a city's story in the language of money and obligation. Margaret had been told the collection was disorganized but manageable. She was not told about the armoire. It stood in the back of a storage room that smelled of mildew and old varnish, pushed against the far wall beneath a water stain shaped, she would later note in her report, like a long vertical crack. The armoire was sealed with a wax strip along the door seam. Not a lock, just a strip of old wax, the kind used to protect furniture from humidity during storage. The wax had been applied at some point after the furniture arrived because the original latch still functioned. No one at the Society could say with certainty when the wax had been applied or by whom. The Society's director at the time, a man named Howard Prewitt, told Margaret simply that the armoire had come with the donation and that nobody had opened it. She broke the wax seal on her third day of work. Inside were 2 shelves of material, more manifests, a bundle of land survey drawings tied with string that had mostly rotted away, and sitting slightly apart from the rest on the lower shelf, a plain wooden box approximately the size of a case of wine bottles, but square. It had no label, no lock, no identifying mark of any kind, except for a faint impression on the lid that might once have been a stamped initial, but had been sanded or worn down to near illegibility. Margaret photographed the box before opening it. Inside the box were approximately 60 documents of varying size, condition, and type. Most were exactly what you would expect: receipts, short letters, a partial inventory of what appeared to be a legal estate, and 2 folded maps of the peninsula. At the bottom of the box, wrapped loosely in a length of cotton that had turned brown and brittle, was a small notebook, approximately 5 inches wide and 7 inches tall, covered in what had once been deep blue cloth, now faded and water-damaged at the corners. No title on the cover, no name. Margaret set everything else aside. She opened the notebook carefully with gloved hands and noted immediately that it had been written in at least 2 different hands, one small and angular, the other rounder and more deliberate, and that several pages had been removed, not torn, removed with something sharp, possibly a knife or a fine blade, cut close to the binding with enough care to leave the spine intact. Whoever had removed those pages had not done so in haste. In the margins of the remaining pages, recurring in both handwriting styles, were 2 pairs of initials, EB and SR. She did not yet know what those initials meant, but she noted them, as she noted everything. Charleston in 1839 was a city that had mastered the performance of civilization. The streets of the Lower Peninsula were lined with houses built in the Charleston single-house style. Narrow facades facing the street, long porticos running along the side to catch the harbor breeze, garden walls that kept the interior lives of families carefully screened from the road. The city's elite moved through a social architecture as deliberate as its physical one. Church on Sunday at St. Philip's or St. Michael's, business conducted at the Exchange, evenings spent at private homes where conversation was polished to a surface that revealed nothing of consequence. The harbor was the engine of everything. Ships arrived from Liverpool, Le Havre, Havana, and the West Indies, carrying manufactured goods and luxury items, and departed loaded with rice, cotton, and indigo. The counting houses on East Bay Street ran the commerce of the region with a bureaucratic precision that required, above all things, accurate documentation. Property records, transfer of title, bills of lading, certificates of ownership. In a city where so much of the labor force was legally classified as property, the integrity of that documentation was not merely commercial. It was the foundation of a social order. It was also, as Margaret would come to understand, the most vulnerable point in that order. The Beaumont family had occupied a position in Charleston's commercial hierarchy for 3 generations by the time Elias Beaumont was born in 1813. His grandfather, a man named Josiah Beaumont, had arrived from Virginia sometime around 1780 and established a modest but successful enterprise importing hardware and dry goods. His son, Edmund Beaumont, expanded that operation considerably, developing relationships with shipping companies and legal firms that made the Beaumont name familiar in counting rooms and courtrooms alike. By the time Edmund's son Elias reached adulthood, the family owned a house on Lagar Street, a warehouse near the wharves on Concord Street, and a comfortable share of several commercial partnerships whose exact structure had never been fully documented for the public record. Elias appears in the historical record as a young man educated in law, reportedly having studied under a senior attorney in the city before being admitted to practice in the late 1830s. He was described in the few surviving references to him as quiet, competent, and unremarkable in his social presentation. He attended the requisite church services. He appeared at the dinners and gatherings expected of someone in his position. He did not gamble noticeably, did not appear in the newspaper for any of the reasons that young men of his class sometimes did, and was, according to a letter from his father, preserved in the collection of a different archive entirely, expected to assume responsibility for the family's legal affairs within a few years. He died in December of 1839. The official record lists the cause as fever. He was 26 years old. There is no obituary in the surviving issues of the Charleston Courier from that period. There is a brief entry in the burial records of a small churchyard on the northern edge of the old city. A record that lists his name, his age, and the date of interment, with no additional notation. The entry appears on a page that contains several other names from the same month, and there is nothing about it that would attract attention unless you were looking specifically for it. Margaret found it on her 9th day of research, cross-referencing names from the notebook's margins against burial and vital records she had requested from 2 different archival institutions. She also found in those 9 days the name Seraphina Rhodes. The name appeared first in a municipal record from 1836, a property transfer document registering the sale of a small dwelling on Trad Street to a woman identified as Seraphina Rhodes, described as a free woman of color, occupation seamstress. The property was modest. The document lists it as a single-story structure with a small workroom attached, but the fact of its existence in a woman's name, in that city, in that decade, was not insignificant. Free black property ownership in Charleston in the 1830s was not impossible, but it was constrained by an elaborate web of legal restrictions, social surveillance, and the constant threat of reclassification that hung over the free black population of the state like a suspended judgment. Serafina was, according to the limited documentation Margaret was able to assemble, approximately 28 years old in 1839. Her mother had been a laundress who had purchased her own freedom sometime in the 18-teens. Her father was identified in no official document, though a baptismal record from a Methodist congregation lists Serafina's parents as Clara Rhodes, free, and a white man, unnamed. In the same record, the officiating minister's name is struck through with a single diagonal line, not erased, just marked, as if someone had returned to the register later and wanted to indicate something without leaving a legible explanation. She appears in several commercial records as a seamstress and, in at least 3 instances, as a copyist. This is the detail that would come to matter most. In a period when legal documents, letters, petitions, and contracts were reproduced entirely by hand, a skilled copyist who could be trusted with sensitive material was genuinely valuable. The people who used Serafina's services as a copyist are not all identifiable, but 2 of them are. A free black Baptist minister named Augustine Wells, who was involved in a property dispute at the time, and a woman named Catherine Fenwick, whose connection to the broader story Margaret would not understand until much later. What Margaret understood first was that Serafina's name began to disappear from documents after 1840, not all at once, gradually. A receipt from 1841 lists a seamstress at the Trad Street address as S.R., initials only, where a full name had appeared before. A church record from 1842 lists a correction to a previous entry. Where Rhodes Serafina had appeared, someone had written over it in different ink, substituting an abbreviation so compressed as to be nearly unreadable. The property on Trad Street appears in an 1843 document under the name of a white male attorney acting under a power of attorney, a document Margaret was unable to locate. Serafina Rhodes was being removed from the record, methodically, over time. Margaret had been working on the collection for 3 weeks when she first brought her concerns to Howard Prewitt. She laid out, in a 2-page written summary, what she had found so far: the notebook with the removed pages, the recurring initials, the basic biographical outlines of Elias Beaumont and Serafina Rhodes, and the pattern of documentary erasure that seemed to begin immediately after Elias's death. She did not claim to know what any of it meant. She noted that the pattern was unusual enough to warrant a more formal investigation, and asked for authorization to expand her research scope to include records held at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History in Columbia. Prewitt read the summary carefully. He asked her 2 questions. The first was whether any of the documents she had found were originals rather than copies. The second was whether she had discussed her findings with anyone outside the society. She had not. He authorized the expanded research. She drove to Columbia the following Monday. The South Carolina Department of Archives and History holds, among its many collections, a significant quantity of antebellum legal and commercial records related to Charleston County. Access to these materials requires advance notice, proper credentials, and patience. Margaret had all 3. What she found in Columbia was not a single dramatic discovery, but a slow accumulation of confirmations, each one individually explainable, collectively forming something that could not be accounted for by coincidence or administrative error alone. She found 3 separate payment records from the Beaumont family account, recorded in a ledger from a counting house that had operated on East Bay Street, made to 3 different individuals in the weeks between October and November of 1839. The amounts were substantial, not fortunes, but significant enough to require explanation. The recipients are identified in the ledger only by initials and a brief description of service. T.M. Matter, attended. W.H. Service rendered, private. B.C. Final settlement. None of these individuals can be identified with certainty from the ledger alone. The payments were made between 6 and 9 weeks before Elias died. She also found, in a collection of miscellaneous correspondence that had been donated to the State Archives in 1953 from the estate of a descendant of one of Charleston's old mercantile families, not the Beaumonts, a different family, a letter that referenced Elias Beaumont by name. The letter was undated, but written on paper that, based on its physical characteristics and context, appeared to be from the early 1840s. It was addressed to no one and signed with only a first name, William. It read in part, "The young Beaumont's trouble was of his own making, as I have said before, and the less spoken of the Rhodes woman, the better for all concerned. What was done before he could do worse." Margaret noted the letter. She photographed it. She returned to Charleston. It took her another 2 weeks to find the Reverend Marcus Caldwell's name. Caldwell was a minister who had served a congregation in Charleston in the late 1830s and had kept, apparently as a personal discipline, a daily journal that he maintained from 1834 until his death in 1861. The journal was held by a small private historical library associated with a Presbyterian congregation on the outskirts of the city. It had been briefly catalogued in the 1940s by a graduate student whose typed index, 3 pages long and incomplete, listed only the broadest topics. The journal itself had never been fully transcribed or published. Margaret requested access on a Wednesday morning in late October. She spent 4 hours with the journal. Caldwell does not write directly about Elias Beaumont or Seraphina Rhodes in any of the entries Margaret examined, but on the 14th of November, 1839, approximately 3 weeks before Elias's death, he writes, "Heard today a thing which I cannot set down clearly, for it touches upon persons whose families remain prominent and whose affairs I have no business entering. But there is a concern about records, about how records are made and unmade, that sits with me like a stone. A man came to see me who is frightened. He says he has seen papers that should not exist, and other papers that should exist but do not. He says a woman is in danger. I counseled him to pray. I do not know that prayer is sufficient." The identity of the man who came to see Caldwell is not recorded. The notebook from the armoire contained on its surviving pages a mixture of notations that Margaret had been slowly working to interpret across the weeks of her research. Some pages appeared to be inventory lists, columns of numbers with abbreviated labels that she initially could not decipher. Others contained brief passages of text in the rounder handwriting style she had come to associate, by process of elimination, with Seraphina Rhodes. These passages were not diary entries, they were closer in form to legal summaries, brief, factual descriptions of documents with dates, reference numbers, and in several cases the names of parties involved. It took Margaret a significant amount of time to understand what she was reading, because she was not initially looking at the material from the right angle. She had been approaching it as a personal record, a diary, a letter file, something intimate. But the notebook was not a personal record. It was, she eventually concluded, a professional one. Seraphina had been documenting discrepancies. The lists and notations in the notebook were records of documents that she had encountered in her work as a copyist, documents in which something did not match, a transfer date that contradicted a bill of sale, a name that appeared in one document as a free person and in another as property, a signature on a deed that she had reason to believe was not genuine. Each notation was brief, precise, and referenced at least one other document that could, in principle, be used to verify or contradict the entry. And in the angular handwriting, Elias's, Margaret was now nearly certain, there were cross-references, additional document numbers, dates of access, a notation that read, in full, EB confirms, Register of Deeds, Book 14, Folios 31 and 32, original differs from copy on file. They had been building something together, a systematic record of falsification. The nature of what they had been documenting became clearer as Margaret assembled more context. The practice, as far as she could reconstruct it, worked approximately as follows. A free person of color who had accumulated modest property or assets could become vulnerable in a debt dispute. If a creditor claimed that the free person owed a debt, and if the documentary record of that person's free status could be questioned, challenged, or quietly altered, the creditor might be able to pursue a claim against not just the property, but the person. This required, in practical terms, that someone with access to official registers be willing to modify them, to change a date, replace a name, correct a status, in ways subtle enough to be overlooked in a routine examination. It was not a unique fraud. Variations of it had been documented vaguely in later historical scholarship, but the specific network that Elias and Serafina appear to have identified was unusual in its coordination. It seemed to involve at least one clerk with access to multiple registers, a legal firm that processed the resulting disputes, and several prominent families who were the ultimate beneficiaries of assets that changed hands through this mechanism. One of those families was the Beaumonts. Margaret found this detail in an unlikely place. A partial copy of a legal brief, handwritten, that appeared among the papers in the original wooden box from the armoire. The brief was incomplete. It was missing its first page and its conclusion, but its subject matter was an estate dispute from 1837 in which property claimed by a free woman named Agnes Mallory had been contested and ultimately transferred. The Beaumont name appears once in the document, in a context that suggests they had a financial interest in the outcome of the dispute. Agnes Mallory does not appear in any subsequent records. The afternoon Margaret found the letter in the Book of Sermons, she sat with it for a long time without moving. The book had been part of the original donation, a bound volume of printed sermons from a Charleston minister, published in 1829 with a Beaumont family bookplate inside the front cover. Margaret had catalogued it weeks earlier and set it aside without examining it closely. She returned to it on a Thursday afternoon because she had found a reference in one of Caldwell's journal entries to a specific sermon title, and she wondered if the same volume might contain it. When she picked up the book and opened it, she noticed that the spine was slightly thicker than the text block warranted. She did not open it further without gloves. Then carefully, she examined the inside of the back cover, where the binding met the spine. The letter had been folded very small, perhaps a dozen times, and pressed into a gap between the lining paper and the spine itself. It was fragile to the point of translucency in places, and two of its folds had torn through, splitting the text. But it was readable. It was written in the angular handwriting. It began, S. If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong, and I am not able to reach you myself. It did not contain expressions of love or grief. It contained a list of names, each followed by a number. It contained a date, November 19th, 1839, which was approximately 1 month before Elias's recorded death, and it contained a single sentence that described the location of a package. Not in a cemetery, not in a church, but under the northeast corner of the floor in the accounting room of a warehouse on Concord Street. The warehouse on Concord Street had been converted to a different use in the 1880s. By 2001, it was a heritage tourism site, a restored antebellum commercial building that offered guided tours of Charleston's maritime history. Margaret contacted the site's management the following morning. Getting authorization to examine the floor of a functioning heritage tourism building took 11 days. Margaret filled out 2 separate permits, provided her credentials 3 times, and spoke by telephone with a representative of the State Historic Preservation Office who was polite but cautious. The examination was ultimately approved as a non-invasive archival inspection, which meant she was permitted to examine but not disturb the original flooring. She went on a Tuesday in November, accompanied by a site staff member and a structural preservationist the building's management had requested be present. They used a fiber optic scope and a ground-penetrating imaging device borrowed from a university department. The examination took most of a morning. The northeast corner of the original accounting room floor, which had survived the building's various renovations beneath a later layer of wood, showed, in the imaging results, a cavity beneath the boards, approximately 40 centimeters square. Empty. Margaret asked about the condition of the boards above the cavity. The preservationist examined them and noted that they had been disturbed. Not recently, she said. The grain patterns and oxidation on the cut edges of the boards suggested the opening had been made and resealed, she estimated, sometime in the latter half of the 19th century. Someone had retrieved the package, most likely, within a generation of it being placed there. What the empty cavity proved, if it proved anything, was that the story had not ended with Elias's death in December of 1839. Someone had known where to look, someone had returned, and the question of who had retrieved the package and what they had done with it afterward opened a new layer of inquiry that Margaret was not, by then, entirely prepared for. She had gone into the project as a document restorer hired to catalogue a collection. By November of 2001, she was something different. A researcher who had spent the better part of 3 months assembling a detailed account of a cover-up that had been sustained with active effort across several decades of the 19th century. The pattern she had documented was not simply one of initial concealment, the removal of pages from a notebook, the falsification of entries, the convenient death of a young attorney who had known too much. It was a pattern of maintenance. Documents had been altered not once but several times, at intervals that suggested ongoing monitoring. Serafina's name had been progressively removed from the record in a process that extended from 1840 through at least 1843. The Beaumont family's financial records showed irregular payments at multiple points through the 1850s, small, inconsistent, unexplained, the kind of payments that a bookkeeper might record without asking questions. It was possible, more than possible, Margaret thought, that Serafina had survived long enough to make herself a problem, that the package retrieved from the warehouse floor had contained documents damaging enough to require continued management, that the payments visible in the Beaumont ledgers were not charitable contributions or commercial transactions, but something closer to the maintenance of a silence. She wrote this in her preliminary report to Howard Prewitt, carefully, in language that acknowledged the speculative nature of the conclusion. Prewitt read the report over a weekend and called her on a Monday morning. He said that the Society was grateful for her work, that the findings were significant, and that he would be presenting the collection to the board for a decision on how to proceed. He asked her not to discuss the specifics of her research publicly until the board had met. The board meeting was postponed twice. In the months following the completion of her formal report, Margaret made several attempts to follow the question of Serafina's fate beyond 1843, the last year for which she had found direct documentary evidence of her existence in Charleston. The conventional historical assumption, when it was articulated at all, was that Serafina had left the city. The pressures on free black residents of South Carolina had intensified considerably through the 1830s and 40s, and many free people of color did relocate to the north, to Ohio, to Philadelphia, and in some cases to Savannah or other Georgia cities, where the social environment, while not without its own constraints, offered different conditions. This was not an unreasonable explanation for the disappearance of a single person from the documentary record, but the nature of the documentary disappearance, the progressive alteration, the property transfer by anonymous proxy, the correction of her name in church records was not consistent with a voluntary relocation. People who left cities did not typically generate the kind of administrative revision that Serafina's record showed. They simply stopped appearing. The effort that had been made to revise her record suggested that someone needed her to not have existed in that form, not simply to be absent, but to have been erased. Margaret searched records in Savannah, in Augusta, in Columbia, and through correspondence with archivists in Philadelphia and Boston. She found 2 women named Rhodes in Savannah area records from the relevant period. One too old to plausibly be Serafina, the other with no further documentation past a single church record from 1847. She found no definitive trace. The photograph came to her attention through a different route. A historian at a small Georgia college had been compiling an annotated image archive of early African American education institutions in the coastal South. In the course of that project, she had digitized a collection of photographs donated by the descendants of a Savannah community organization and had posted a selection of them to a database accessible to academic researchers. Margaret was searching that database for a different purpose when she found it. The photograph was dated approximately 1903 to 1908, based on physical and contextual evidence. It showed the exterior of a small wooden building, identified in a handwritten caption as a community school. Standing to the left of the entrance was a group of 6 or 7 young women, and slightly apart from them, near the door, an elderly woman in dark clothing. On the verso of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "She taught the girls to write their own names." The elderly woman wore at her collar a small oval pendant. In the digitized image, the detail was difficult to read clearly. Margaret enlarged the image several times. The pendant appeared to show 2 engraved initials, E.B. She could not confirm this identification with certainty. The image resolution was insufficient. The woman's face, partially shadowed, could not be matched to any other photographic record because no other photographic record of Serafina Rhodes was known to exist. The pendant could have been acquired in any number of ways, could have meant any number of things, but Margaret included the photograph in her final report, accompanied by a full discussion of its limitations and the impossibility of confirmation. She noted the initials. She noted the date. She noted that if the woman in the photograph was the same Serafina Rhodes documented in Charleston records from the 1830s, she would have been approximately 95 years old. Unlikely, but not impossible for a woman who had survived what she appeared to have survived. The board of the Carolina Historical Preservation Society met in January of 2002 and issued a statement acknowledging the significance of the collection and indicating that further research would be needed before any public disclosure. They commissioned an additional review by 2 outside historians, a process that took 14 months. The outside historians' report, which Margaret was not shown directly, apparently confirmed the authenticity of the documents, while stopping short of the broader interpretive conclusions she had drawn. A small portion of the collection was displayed in a temporary exhibition at the Society in 2004. The notebook with the removed pages was not included. The exhibition's descriptive text noted that the materials shed light on the complex commercial history of antebellum Charleston, and acknowledged the presence of materials related to individuals of various social standings. Serafina Rhodes was mentioned by name in one panel, Elias Beaumont was described as a young attorney of the Beaumont family. No connection between them was stated explicitly. Margaret attended the opening of the exhibition. She did not speak to the press. Before the exhibition opened, she had made digital copies of every document in the collection that she had personally handled during her months of research. She deposited those copies with 3 separate institutions: the Atlanta-based archives of a civil rights documentation project, the library of a historically black university in Columbia, and a digital preservation initiative affiliated with a consortium of independent historical research organizations. She sent a detailed summary of her findings to each institution, marked for restricted access to be lifted at the discretion of the receiving archivist after a period of not less than 5 years. She also sent a copy to the historian in Georgia who had posted the photograph. There is, in the records of the Beaumont family, the partial records that survive, held across several different repositories in South Carolina, a gap that no one has satisfactorily explained. The family's financial records, which are reasonably well preserved for the period before 1839, become fragmentary and inconsistent from that year forward. The gap is not total. Ledger entries continue, property records exist. The family's name appears in commercial and legal documents through the 1850s and beyond, but the quality of the documentation changes. Where before there were careful, orderly columns in multiple ledgers cross-referencing each other, after 1839 there are single entries with abbreviated notations and, in several cases, pages that have been removed from bound ledgers with the same precise cutting technique visible in the notebook from the armoire. A researcher examining the Beaumont records in isolation, without context, would likely attribute this to changes in record-keeping practice or simple deterioration. In context, the pattern reads differently. Edmund Beaumont, Elias's father, died in 1853. His estate inventory, filed in probate court, is unusually brief for a man of his commercial stature, shorter than the inventories of several men whose estates were considerably smaller. Several categories of assets that would normally appear in such an inventory are absent or listed only as matters previously settled. The attorney who filed the inventory was not the Beaumont family's regular legal counsel. He was a man named H.C. Broward, who appears in no other Beaumont document before or after this one. The estate was settled in a period of 4 months. Estates of similar complexity in the same period typically took considerably longer. What happened in those weeks in the autumn of 1839, in the offices on East Bay Street, in the small house on Tradd Street, in the yards and counting rooms and quiet back parlors of a city that had built its dignity on the careful management of information, cannot be fully reconstructed. The people who knew the whole story left no complete account, or their accounts were destroyed, or they are buried in materials that have not yet been found and perhaps never will be. What the documents suggest, assembled from several collections, cross-referenced across multiple archives, is the following sequence. In the months before his death, Elias Beaumont had been working in collaboration with Serafina Rhodes to assemble a documentary record of a systematic fraud. The fraud involved the manipulation of official records to allow free persons of color to be reclassified effectively as property in debt and inheritance disputes, and the Beaumont family had benefited from this fraud, directly or indirectly, more than once. Elias had access to the internal documents. Serafina had the skills to copy, analyze, and organize them. Together they had accumulated enough material to be dangerous. Someone decided at some point in October or November of 1839 that this situation required a resolution. The 3 payments recorded in the Beaumont ledger to TMWH and BC were made between October and November. Elias died in December. The letter in the spine of the sermon book was dated November 19th, meaning Elias was still alive when he wrote it, and aware enough of his situation to leave what amounted to a final set of instructions. He had written, "If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong and I am not able to reach you myself. It is not known whether Serafina received the letter before or after his death. It is not known whether the package under the accounting room floor was retrieved by her, by someone she trusted, or by someone acting against her interests. The cavity was empty. The emptiness is, in a sense, the only definitive conclusion available. Whatever was there, it was recovered." And then, across the next several years, Serafina's documented existence in Charleston was systematically reduced to near nothing. In 1967, an archivist at a repository in Columbia conducting a routine survey of deteriorating materials in a restricted storage area found a box of miscellaneous documents that had been improperly accessioned in the 1920s. Among the contents was a bundle of papers that appeared to relate to a Charleston legal matter from the 1840s. The archivist, whose name appears in the survey log as T. Harrington, noted in the log that the materials appeared to be copies of legal documents, condition poor, possible relevance to dispute records, period approximately 1840 to 1850. The materials were stabilized and placed in acid-free folders. They were not further processed. The survey log was filed and largely forgotten. In 1967, the box was reshelved and a reference number assigned. The number appears in a typewritten index completed sometime in the early 1970s that has since been partially superseded by a digital catalogue. The materials are listed in the superseded index as Charleston Commercial Dispute Papers, circa 1840 to 1850. Provenance unknown. Margaret Ellison found a reference to this listing in a footnote of a 1989 dissertation on antebellum South Carolina legal history. The dissertation's author, a graduate student named Arthur Pickens, had accessed the collection briefly and dismissed it as too fragmentary to be useful. She drove to Columbia in February of 2002 after the Society's board meeting. The documents in the box were in poor condition but legible. Several of them appeared to be copies, not originals, but careful handwritten copies, of legal records related to property disputes from the 1840s involving free persons of color in the Charleston area. The handwriting in which the copies had been made was consistent throughout all the documents, with the rounder of the two handwriting styles visible in the notebook from the armoire. The copy of Margaret's final comprehensive report that was deposited with the historically black university in Columbia was accessed, according to the institution's records, 14 times between 2007 and 2019 by researchers working on various aspects of antebellum South Carolina history. 3 of those researchers cited related materials in published work, in footnotes that most readers would not pause over. The notebook with the removed pages remained in the possession of the Carolina Historical Preservation Society, housed in a climate-controlled storage facility. Its current exhibition status is not publicly listed. The house on Trad Street no longer exists in its original form. The block was substantially redeveloped in the early 20th century. A building on the approximate site operates today as a bed and breakfast. Its website describes the area as a historic district. The warehouse on Concord Street is still a heritage tourism site. The accounting room floor, with its repaired boards over the empty cavity, is walked over by visitors on guided tours several days a week. The tours discuss the building's role in Charleston's antebellum maritime commerce. The guides are knowledgeable and precise about dates, cargo volumes, and the names of prominent merchants. The northeast corner of the floor receives no particular mention. The photograph from the Georgia archive, the elderly woman near the door of the small school, the penciled note on the verso, the pendant at her collar, remains unverified. The historian who digitized it retired in 2012. The original photograph is held by the donating family's descendants, who have not made it available for further examination. Whether the woman in the photograph is Serafina Rhodes cannot be confirmed by any evidence currently known. The pendant's initials, if they are what they appear to be, would indicate EB, a monogram associated with Elias Beaumont, and also, it should be noted, with an indeterminate number of other men with those initials. The coincidence is notable. It is not proof. What is documented across the various collections is the following. Elias Beaumont died in December of 1839, under circumstances that the available record does not fully account for. Serafina Rhodes was alive and identifiable in Charleston records through approximately 1843, after which her documented presence in that city effectively ceases. A systematic effort was made during and after her residence in Charleston to reduce her presence in the official record. Documents associated with both individuals show signs of deliberate alteration. A collection of materials that appear to have been assembled by both individuals as evidence of a coordinated legal fraud was partially preserved in a notebook whose most significant pages were removed before it was sealed in a box in an armoire that remained unopened for approximately 60 years. The investigators, such as they were, did not survive to present their evidence publicly. The fraud they documented was never prosecuted. The families who benefited from it continued to benefit, through inheritance and commercial advantage for generations afterward. In 1839, Charleston was a city that had mastered the art of maintaining surfaces. Some surfaces are still in place. The penciled note on the back of the photograph says only, "She taught the girls to write their own names." It does not say who wrote the note. It does not say who the woman was. It does not explain anything, really. It sits in an archive in Georgia, in an acid-free folder, filed under the reference number assigned to it when it was donated. It has not been displayed publicly. It is accessible in principle to any researcher who requests it through the proper channels. Some things are preserved not to be found, but simply to survive. Whether that is a comfort or an indictment depends on what you believe the purpose of an archive is. No further determination has been made.